just what a black person is when they come out? Or do you think that post-welfare, LBJ, Great Society, this is what black Americans have become, and I have a right to respond to that and say that as a white man, I don't want to live there?
Well, you know, I think it's more nature than people would like to believe. You know, there's this classic tension of, is it nature, is it nurture, is it cultural, or is it intrinsic, is it racial? And I've always been on the latter side of this among conservatives. Conservatives like to say it's all culture. Black America is the way it is because of hip-hop music and the Great Society and that kind of stuff. And I think the uncomfortable reality is a big part of it is intrinsic. You know, one of the big arguments...
Having sex with my dog is the same thing as me having sex with a black man.
No. But they would both be degenerate.
Oh! Realism is the position that race is a biological reality, not a social construct. Any society premised on the denial of race will collapse from accumulated error, just as any bridge built on false measurements will collapse from accumulated strain.
You may be surprised to find that this quote was actually talking about Southern whites. If you take a look throughout history, groups just discriminated against other groups. Whites discriminated against whites as they did, well, non-whites. And if you take even a closer look at the history of the antebellum South, we find many similarities to the problems that we see in modernity and today. So much so, a survey in 1951 found that in Detroit, white Southerners living there were considered undesirable by 21% of those surveyed, compared to 13% who ranked blacks the same way. The South before the Civil War is very much different than the South we know today. A fringe Southern Scottish culture in the South had yet to develop in response to the Industrial Revolution. This culture was identified primarily as being prideful to the point of violence, hedonistic or pleasure-seeking, distrustful of any and all institutions, yet simultaneously intensely religious. I'm not trying to make the argument that the culture we see in the ghetto today is actually just a later adaptation of this Southern cracker culture. However, it is true that many of the problems in society are not unique to being white or black. A major detail that gets left out among many white nationalists particularly is that Americans did discriminate against other whites, particularly Irish whites. Even though they were considered American citizens, Irish people were discriminated against to the point of having signs that said, well, this. And also people who, well, I'll just show you. But let's actually take a deeper dive into the history of the United States when it comes to race. Let's go the whole way back to the 19th century, or the 1800s, where we're going to look at a very small high school known as Dunbar High School in Washington, D.C. Dunbar High School was an all-black school, and this school actually averaged higher test scores than students in 2 of the 3 white high schools of the time. In this high school had consistent academic and scholastic success from the 1870s to the 1950s, but then this started to change. More data actually demonstrates that the common narrative that we're told, that the legacy of slavery and redlining is what is holding back the black community in today's world, just doesn't hold up under much scrutiny. Where, remember, redlining was introduced in 1933, while the Civil Rights Act was introduced in the 1960s. So if we actually look at the data of things like black home ownership by state, we see that in states like Minnesota, we saw a 20% increase in black home ownership from the 1950s or the 1970s. And in states like New York, we saw a 10% increase. So despite the fact that African Americans and blacks were discriminated against, they still managed to grow more under this than they do after the Civil Rights Act. This is definitely not an argument to bring back. So ultimately, the problem that I see with this, quote, white nationalism or America First is ultimately defining what the hell they mean by race and what the hell they mean by America First. even though that there are stronger phenotypical correlations among ethnicities than race, the former other white ethnicities from European countries were described as races. And even still, we see different countries have national identities that involve multiple ethnicities depending on that country's history. Primarily, we see this with the United Kingdom, where we can see Scots, Welsh, and Irish forming a unified identity. And this is not to say that it's a good idea to just diversify everything, as we see in, well, Europe right now. So when did this all start to happen in the US is, well, it goes back to the 1970s, where the divorce rate among black women actually skyrockets, despite the fact that black women were originally more likely to be married than white women. And the trends stagnate or even possibly reverse in some areas because, well, the family structure is completely destroyed. And there's many things that do contribute to this, and I'm not necessarily going into depth of all of this. However, what changed was things like the sexual revolution, and you might know the common phrase, sex, drugs, rock and roll, the rise of the internet and dating apps, which later came in the 2000s, which made things worse for, well, I would argue everybody. And there is the Great Society programs that did contribute, but I'm primarily talking about right now the cultural impact of people like Sigmund Freud, Margaret Mead, Alfred Kinsey, Masters and Johnson, Norman O. Brown, and Herbert McCooey, if that's how you pronounce his name. I honestly don't know. I just know a lot of these people are really, really weird, not gonna lie. But anyway, this community suffers significantly from fatherlessness, where we see pretty much in every single stat ever that fatherless households have worse outcomes just across the board. So that leads us to the problem of white nationalism, more particularly the idea of race realism. For the sake of argument, I'll be defining this as the belief that races are distinct biological categories, and they are the primary explanation of the disparities between these different racial groups. This is opposed to primarily cultural or systemic explanations of these disparities. A big problem that I find in this view is, well, the categorization problem. Human beings don't actually uniformly fall into racial groups. Many realists just kind of compare this to dog breeds. And an analogy is to compare black people to pit bulls because of their increased rate of violence. The genetic diversity is simply not significant enough to justify a separate classification. The total human genetic variation globally can be estimated at around 3.3 to 4.7 globally. This is compared to 27% among dog breeds. Even still, skin color is not even necessarily correlated to distinct groups, but rather groups located to the equator. Not to mention, Indo-Aryan, or what we know as most Indians, and Han Chinese can both technically be classified as Asian. But the entire race realist argument hinges on the disparities in IQ among races. So let's actually take a deeper dive into the truth concerning IQ. A place to start is to look at black orphans adopted by white families. A study was conducted by Professor Sandra Scar from the University of Minnesota. The study found black orphans adopted by white families actually had an IQ of 106, which is actually currently above the national white IQ today. This IQ for whites is around 100. A common rebuttal by the race realist is white children who have two white parents in the household still have a higher average IQ than the previously mentioned black 106. Yet the genetic argument falls short because really pivoting this to a respective race doesn't actually give the full picture over history. Another study can be found by Jim Flynn in 1991, where it was found that Chinese and Japanese Americans historically actually had lower IQs than the white 100. In other words, there was a time when Japanese and Chinese Americans did worse than whites on IQ tests. Yet in today's world, many people kind of look up to the model minority that is Chinese and Japanese Americans, where they have actually surpassed the white IQ average, now holding an average IQ of 106 or even higher. So if the racial argument actually holds water, how can someone be predetermined to these intellectual outcomes by race whenever the group that formerly had lower IQs surpassed the white average? The evidence greatly supports what is known as the Flynn effect, where we can find that IQ scores actually increase over time in countries around the globe. We can find plenty of quality evidence in data that supports this, particularly a wide variety of meta-analyses and systemic reviews support this conclusion. The reason why we see an increase particularly is because of our society's greater emphasis on things like abstract thinking, and also taking tests. This can act as a form of compounded interest over multiple generations, primarily because a society that has high expectations usually produces better results in the respective category. More people become experts of their craft, so to speak. Societies then specialize, and as societies continue to specialize, especially in things like STEM, people get better IQ scores. What's often left out about the entire intelligence or IQ debate is when people think about environmental factors affecting intelligence, they usually get it all wrong. A lot of people think that if you do maybe more Duolingo or Lumosity, you're somehow going to become Einstein himself for some reason. Yet the most significant environmental factors are usually during pregnancy or the formative years of development. What we see is evidence that demonstrates even things like maternal obesity can have great impacts on the cognitive development of young children. There's even evidence that suggests differences that are comparable to lead exposure in early childhood. What we can even actually see is that diet choices in the formative years can have a substantial impact on someone's development. Primarily, these are diets that are high in fat and sugar. And here are a bunch of other sources that demonstrate this, and I highly recommend that you read this for yourself to form an opinion. I would say that meta-analyses are usually pretty trustworthy when it comes to these sorts of things, especially when there's a lot of confounding variables that go into something like diet. But pretty much a society that normalizes literal hush puppies or fried bread as food may have a tiny bit of a problem. A pattern of nutrition affecting cognitive development also remains true with things like malnutrition. Some studies even suggest that up to 15 points of IQ can be affected by malnutrition. Even more so controversially, the introduction of substances like cannabis at a young age may have impacts on cognitive ability as well. Longitudinal and meta-analyses also demonstrate this happening. This study particularly demonstrated that cannabis use may decline IQ by up to 2 points. But with any study that has limitations, the author suggested it might be more realistic to look over longer periods of time and also measure the amount of exposure to these substances, or more frequently called a dose-response relationship. Yet still, despite the fact the environment and personal habits can greatly impact something like intelligence, there are more examples how these disparities were not always the case historically. We can actually find studies that go back to the First World War, where we need to also remember that during this time, IQ tests were not popularized, and most of many countries were illiterate. So the US Army administered alpha-beta tests in all states in 1919 that typically had pictures being shown to people for assessing cognitive ability. What they found was very surprising. The evidence actually showed that northern blacks could and would outperform southern whites. And I don't know about you, but it seems pretty consistent that a culture can have a significant impact on the development of an individual and even a civilization as a whole. So this leads to the final question, which many people ask, well, if there's all these issues in the US due to culture, then how can we explain things like Africa and why they're so far behind compared to other continents? Why is this true even before European colonization? History has many factors that go into it. However, we should not expect every civilization to develop the same with time, primarily because every civilization faces different problems. For example, there's no reason to expect that Mongolia is going to have the most advanced or most powerful navy in the world. It may be reasonable to conclude an island like the United Kingdom will prosper in seafaring, however. There are civilizations that were even successful before European ones. Primarily, these included things like Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt, the Indus River Valley, or ancient China. Acknowledging this fact does not take away from the accomplishments of someone's country. We can start by saying that some of the factors that can explain the situation of Africa involve things not limited to its geography, traditional practices, and constant ethnic conflict. Africa has a significant water scarcity problem, primarily because there are so few rivers, but also because the reservoir infrastructure is expensive to build, but this also ties into the ethnic conflicts that go on in Africa. Africans are not united as Africans, just as Europeans are not united as a monolithic European identity. People are inevitably going to have conflicts between prevailing ethnic groups, especially when there is not a unified, integrated, or recognized national identity. This is significant, that you may even remember learning about in history class the Rwandan genocide between the Hutu and the Tutsi. Unfortunately, this left many Rwandans dead and a country destabilized. What we can conclude is a large number of groups competing for scarce resources usually does not go well for the expensive infrastructure it takes to harness these resources. We can see this along ethnic lines or even religious lines, such as the Muslims versus the Christians in North Africa. But also, this gets worse when foreign superpowers are involved. Even still, when we see more decentralization, there is problems with things like voodoo cultures. A better way to call this would be African paganism. This was demonstrated in the Congolese Civil War. For the record, the former Soviet Union and the US both had interests in the uranium of the Congo. What the US Army found was the communist and the Western sides backed in this conflict would both respond to ideas of witchcraft or magic. So much so that psychological operations struggle significantly because plots and messages would have to be interpreted differently for each tribe. Even though many Congolese say they are Catholic, most of the time African societies incorporate the Catholic values over top of their voodoo practice. So this is known as African syncretism, which is condemned by the Catholic Church. Someone does not even have to look to Africa to see the problems voodoo can have on a society or culture. South of the United States, someone can simply analyze the statistics of countries like Haiti or the Dominican Republic. Both countries can struggle from problems such as hurricanes or flooding, yet both fare off very differently. This is despite the fact Haitians are predominantly of African descent. The stats show massive disparities not only in health, but also in GDP per capita. A similar pattern holds. Despite the fact many Haitians say they are Roman Catholic, many still continue to practice voodoo. In very interesting ways, I guess. This form of neo-paganism can especially be common among Hispanic groups in the US. Many different cartels will have cartel or death saints, yet again, leading large amounts of conflict between groups. This pattern can even be demonstrated historically among white groups, where the fall of Rome is a clear example of this phenomenon. The Germanic tribes were described as barbarians and constantly raided the Roman Empire. Many of these tribes practice a form of paganism, which contributed to the decentralization, and I would argue even more conflict. Many of these groups continued to be decentralized for large amounts of history, ultimately leading to a wide variety of conflicts to form throughout antiquity and the medieval periods. The conclusion I came to is, primarily after my research, is it's not really about race. It really just seems to be about us. Regardless of race, we all share the same human nature. History does not repeat itself, usually that is, but it very often does wrong.